Well, good evening, Liberty Mears. I'm so glad to see you tonight. Thank you so much for joining me. Tonight, we're going to be talking about an essay that I would bet you've never read. I went for years without having read it, and now I'm just so excited to talk to you about it because I think it's a really important classic in modern libertarian history. We have access to it. Liberty.me has an edition of this book in its library, which you can download very, very easily and read it. It's not long. It's really an essay. This one has an essay before and an essay afterwards to help you get the context. But the topic is libertarianism, actually. And the essay is by Karl Hess, called The End of Politics. It was published in 1969, which was really at it serves as the founding document in a way of the birth of modern libertarianism. We've usually thought of at least I have Murray Rothbard's 1971 essay in the New York Times as being the thing that sort of kicked off libertarianism, and then followed up by For a New Liberty, which came out in 1972, the same year the Libertarian Party was founded. So it seems to be like this bunch of things happening all at once. But really, this essay in Playboy in 1969 had a gigantic circulation, put Karl Hess on the map, and was probably the largest circulation essay on the topic of human liberty, well, I guess arguably in the history of the world, actually. Maybe next to Thomas Paine, it probably exceeded the distribution of that. It was huge, it was hugely important, and Karl Hess was a major thinker. So why is this essay important for us to read now? Is it just historiographic, look back and see what people believed? Well, I think it has significance for us today for a different reason. And it has to do with the ongoing debate that's very much alive on the internet. And if you spend any time on Facebook or, and for that matter, Liberty.me, because we talk about this stuff all the time, or pay attention to national politics, it's a question of what is libertarianism? And why is it so difficult for people to understand that and to understand its implications and applications in the real world? And how does that intersect with what I might call the political cultural biases of our time? I mean, these days we have ongoing debates, right? Oh, the right libertarians, say this. The left libertarians say that. Then we've got the voluntarist movement. We've got the agorists and the anarchists and the minimal statists and the constitutionalists and the objectivists. And who else could I throw into the mix? I guess, there's a kind of a far left syndicalists. We've also got, a very wicked thing going on out there, which I discussed with my essay that was published, I guess, about a year and a half ago, called Against Libertarian Brutalism, where you basically have, authoritarian nativists and nationalists and, quite frankly, malicious racists using libertarianism as a kind of an apparatus to assert their own paradigm, and sort of hijacking the libertarian message as a way of kind of pushing an agenda that's actually radically anti-liberal. And they can do this through a circuitous route. But the same thing is true, I would say, on the far left. So everybody's trying to use language of libertarianism and use libertarianism as an ideology for their own purpose. So in such times like this, it can actually get very confusing, especially in a political season like ours, right? So just for example, everybody wants to know, who is the most libertarian candidate, running for the GOP, since everybody just kind of rules out the Democrats as, hopeless. So there's ongoing debates, is it Rand Paul? Well, he's made compromise in this area, that area. He doesn't speak like a libertarian when it comes to Iran, or he's made various deviations in foreign policy. You never know where he's going to pop up the next day saying something that actually is contradictory to this libertarianism. He himself said he's not a libertarian, although you read his books, and I've read and reviewed a couple of his books. They're wonderful. They're basic statements of a kind of a paradigmatic libertarian outlook. As close as you could likely to come in modern politics. His voting record is for the most part better than any other senator. So you've got a lot of libertarians that are supporting Iran. On the other hand, you've got people looking at Trump, with his sort of disruptive ways, calling out the political establishment and making some very valid points about the corruption of the present regime. So you have libertarians saying, well, Trump is our man, forgetting in fact that just because a person is a critic of the current regime, that doesn't necessarily make them a standard bearer for a brighter future. One of the things that I'm always reminded about in political season is that no matter how bad the status quo is, there's always the chance that it can get worse, But anyway, my point is that there's a lot of confusion out there. What is libertarianism? What is it we believe? Where do our cultural, social, political biases lead us? What's the kind of orientation, the mentality we need to take to the world to understand the world? What should we be dreaming of? And in light of those dreams, who is it that's most, and what is it that's most worthy of our backing? Where should our sympathies lie? And this is actually a serious issue. I mean, day to day for libertarians, because we've seen this over the last year, with riots against police abuse and that sort of thing. Or for that matter, when we watch something like the Occupy movement, these issues that make us feel uncomfortable, or Black Lives Matter movement, for that matter, we see these movements that are kind of popular and extant and making a lot of noise and getting a lot of attention. And we ask ourselves, as lovers of human liberty, am I a supporter of this? Should I be a supporter of this? Should I sympathize with the rioters in the case of Baltimore? And how far should my sympathies go? Are we naturally allies of the Black Lives Matter movement, or are we being dragged into something that's essentially a project that has nothing to do with what we believe? For that matter, the immigration debate is another good example of that, because you've got this Trump guy who's basically in this country, immigration is effectively banned. You can't get in. You can't get in legally. It's the new prohibition, and you've got just like you had in prohibition times, people calling for further crackdowns, against the violators. It's a similar situation now with the immigration. You've got, the Republican politicians, and actually everybody on the left is the same way. Bernie Sanders gave an interview the other day decrying open immigration. It's, a capitalist racket being pushed by the Charles Koch. So, you've got everybody sort of pushing for, let's build a wall. Oh, let's investigate every business. Let's, have the government, crack down even further and higher criminal penalties for hiring non-documented workers and so on. And there's a big debate within the libertarian world, about this. Like, where should our sympathies lie on this? I don't, frankly, understand why there's a debate about this. I don't think there even should be a debate about this. It seems like a non-debatable proposition. This country, has always been a country of free immigration up until basically because it belonged to the states, and the states, obviously welcomed in all types of immigration until about 1890, when the whole process was nationalized. And then there was a massive crackdown on immigration in the 1920s based on eugenic concerns. At the same time as we got labor legislation and everything else. All done for eugenic reasons and statist progressivist reasons. Limiting immigration was definitely a statist progressivist movement, the same movement that gave us the Fed and the income tax and labor regulations and antitrust laws. Protectionism also gave us massive immigration controls. They all go together. These began to be liberalized in 1965, but then more recently, especially since 9/11, the crackdown has been so severe. You basically got a ban on immigration in this country effectively. Yes, some immigrants get in, some people are get green cards, some people are made citizens in the same sense that communion wine was allowed during Prohibition. But the idea that that we've got an immigration problem in this country strikes me as just not factually correct. But nonetheless, you have, in light of this whole debate, libertarians weighing in on both sides. So I guess my point is that in the day-to-day struggle of political life, there's always a tendency, I think, for us to forget who we are and what we are and what it is we believe and where we stand socially, culturally, politically, ideologically within the dominant scheme of the policy paradigms and the ideological orientation of our time. I think back, for example, to Mises's brilliant book from 1927, I believe, Liberalism. And he said that liberalism has a real problem in our age because political ideology is everywhere filtered through political parties. And political parties, Mises said, are founded to represent a special interest of one sort or another. The dominant corporations, some aspect of the ruling class, the dominant corporations, the public sector, the warfare machine, the cultural theocrats, whatever it is. Every political party is founded to advance a particular interest of a particular group. Mises said, in contrast, liberalism stands over and above all of these groups and all of these parties because it's the one outlook, and this is what Mises said, that truly can genuinely and authentically and truthfully say that we and our outlook are in favor of the common interest of everybody. That we favor a harmony of interests throughout the whole of society. We don't want groups fighting each other. We don't want corporations winning at the expense of labor. We don't want labor winning at the expense of corporations, or banks pillaging dollar holders, or large corporations imposing protectionism, or consumers winning over producers, producers over consumers, blacks over whites, Christians over Jews, and so on. We don't believe that these conflicts are an integral part of social life. We believe that these conflicts come about as a result of the state itself, over politicization of everything. When politics gets involved at any level, in any way, in any aspect of society, when the state intervenes and monopolizes a single sector, then it's going to divide people against each other, to pit interests against each other, because basically every government intervention is using the state to pillage some people's property and give it to other people, or give it to themselves at other people's expense. Pillaging, looting, stealing, coercing, those create conflict, whereas a natural order, a market economy of freedom and liberality creates opportunities for emergent forms of harmony to exist in the world. So he said, for this reason, liberalism can genuinely and authentically say, we favor the common interests of everybody. And, in fact, nobody else truly does. So that's nice. That's a very interesting perspective. Mises's book sought to teach people the principles behind this observation of the harmony of interests. So he marches through a series of things that we believe in peace, not protection, trade, not war, mutual association and freedom of movement, not immigration controls and taxation, free enterprise rather than regulation, and so on. And he explains it on issue after issue. But one of the things that is is a little peculiar and difficult about liberalism or libertarianism. I actually prefer the word liberalism to libertarianism. It's just more historically accurate, although I think people understand what I mean when I say libertarianism, but they don't always know what I mean when I say liberalism. The thing that makes it distinct from the reds and the browns and the greens is that our outlook on life takes 2 or 3 steps of logic to understand. It's a very high-minded and elevated position that is not immediately intuitive to people. It actually, to become a liberal in spirit, to become an overt and conscious libertarian, requires a consciousness raising. It requires perhaps some reading, some careful thought, and some deep discernment to embrace an abstraction as a political principle. And that, my friends, is a slight problem for us, and it always has been. That level of abstraction, that sort of elevated sense of things, that ideology that goes beyond just gut level instinct, but rather requires an aspirational sense. It requires your reason, your understanding. It requires that we employ our minds, in a discerning way to understand cause and effect in a way that's not immediately obvious. That's a difficult position to take. And so there's a sense in which, in the great ideological struggles of our time, liberalism or libertarianism is always disadvantaged relative to the browns, the greens, and the reds. If you think about it, what are our principles? What are our slogans? We believe in universal human rights. Well, universal is a big notion. It's a big abstraction. It's very difficult. We believe in globalism, where nations are basically artificial. Well, people have a hard time thinking about globally. People think about their own interests in their own space, not global interests. We believe in notions like the spontaneous order, the gradual emergence of civilization through a period of trial and error. We believe in a society that's always forward moving and forward looking, that's filled with experimentation, where however unsatisfactory the present may be, you can have some confidence that if we permit maximum space for creativity, that beautiful things will emerge in the future. We believe that to understand the costs of bad policy, you have to look beyond what is seen. You have to see the unseen, We have to observe the opportunity and the costs in the world of pathways not taken as a result of government imposition. And we have to have hope in the capacity of human beings to experience problems in their lives, discover solutions to those problems, and implement them on an experimental basis, and test them against ongoing entrepreneurship in every sector of life, whether it's technology or communications or criminal justice or any other area, education, healthcare, you name it. So to believe in freedom is not to believe that you have all the answers. It's to believe that it poses the freedom itself offers the best hope for discovering the right answers. We don't have everything now, but if we have maximum freedom, we have a far greater likelihood of discovering creative solutions down the line. We're not promising anyone a perfect society, but we are promising the best possible hope for gradually struggling our way into a better and better life. That's our promise. But as you listen to my little soliloquy just then, you'll notice that everything I said was an abstraction. Everything requires an elevated sense. It requires seeing things that aren't in front of you. It requires thinking beyond just the immediate, but rather thinking about the long term. And those are all higher sensibilities, you know? Now, compare that to the browns, the greens, and the reds. And the browns have tactile things, you know? Strength, blood, nation. Here's my flag. Here's my war. Sacrifice, race, faith, my family, you know, and so on. I mean, these are all very rooted concerns. They're rooted in the experience of life, day to day, you know, my interests, my people, my religion, my God, you know, and so on. And if you elevate all these principles up, my people, especially my race, elevate all those principles up to first level political concerns, what you end up with is a very robust tradition of fascism. I mean, that was the concerns, that was the way the ancient world worked. These were the political issues that drove the ancient world, and these are the issues that drove the rise of interwar dictatorships all across the 20th century. You know, people tend to rally around these kinds of things. I mean, you don't have to look any further than to understand the popularity of Donald Trump. I mean, you know, he's not preaching fascism as such by name, but he's got the dog whistle on, and he's blowing this all the time, you know? So you've got resentment against modernity there, you know, the hint of misogyny that we've seen over the last couple of days in his, it's far more than a hint. I mean, it's overt. You know, that's also part of this apparatus. You know, these are tactile things, real things, you know, race, sex, religion, you know, and which is not to say that liberalism can't concern itself with those issues. The point is that liberalism rises above those issues to find more broad principles that we can all rally around. But though, as I say, they tend to be always abstractions. So that covers the browns, and then you look at the reds. You know, I mean, here you have a kind of a faux idealism at work. You know, it's like very superficial. Oh, look how wealthy the world is. Look how many people have money. Oh, look at all the people that have more money than other people. How about we just redistribute everything? In fact, why don't we just share everything together? We live in a world of plenty. Let's just have socialism so that we can all have access to each other's property and wealth. And then surely that will make us one big community and live happier, healthier, truer lives. Oh, here's a conflict. Well, let's use force to resolve it. You know, let's just implement a kind of enlightened public policy to force people together. You know, and prevent injustice and unfairness. You know, there's a childishness to sort of red style philosophy. Like every child, you know, the first political sense they have in this world is that something is not fair. Oh, it's not fair. You have something, I don't. That's not fair. You're getting a privilege I don't have. That's not fair. Let's redistribute things. Let's call in mom and dad and fix the situation in a way that satisfies my lust for fairness. My envy can be satisfied. My base political sense of distributed justice can be fed through the imposition of authority of a parent, of a central planner. And that's red style ideology, rooted base, first line thinking, first level intuitions that people have as children, grown up into a political philosophy that actually is deeply wicked and horribly evil. And then the green philosophy, you know, which is just equally superficial. Oh, you know, look how bad it is that people are destroying the mountains. You know, they're cutting down the forests. We're digging into the ground to unearth oil and running our machines. And whereas we should just be satisfied to look at nature, look at the moon, look at the flowers, enjoy the loveliness of the planet all around us, I mean, a very naive, childish outlook that nature is not dangerous. No, nature is not deadly. Nature is not filled with killer animals and killer bugs. It's something we have to tame and use for our purposes. No, nature is something that our primary obligation to it is to just let it be complete and to become part of that, and otherwise never damage that. And I'm amazed at the respectability with which green style philosophy is treated today in public discourse. I mean, essentially, this is a cult. I mean, all of them are cults in a way, but I mean, the Greens are especially cult-like, because they have these hysterical views that somehow we're violating the natural law by driving around, embracing technology, watching too much Netflix, plugging everything in all the time. We're living too decadently. We need to unplug everything. And if we keep going on like this, then surely the world's going to blow up, and melt. It's almost like a religious tenet. Like God's going to punish us. Mother Earth's going to come and punish us. This is green style philosophy. Anyway, that's enough of the alternatives. I mean, libertarianism really does rise above and beyond all these things. It goes beyond childish political instincts. It goes beyond, thrown at altar blood as race instincts, and it goes beyond these, superficial cult-like religious devotion to Mother Nature, to actually use reason and intelligence to understand cause and effect in the world. So it's a much more idealistic position than any other position that's out there. And I think for libertarians, it can be sometimes difficult to remember this, to understand this, and to avoid the trappings of the left, right, and the browns, the greens, and the reds all around us, not be sort of buffeted around by the latest political fashion. So libertarians typically also have like an inferiority complex in a way. We think of ourselves as being overly neglected, by public life, and our essays are not published in the right places. We get really upset all the time that we're not being treated seriously. We're constantly being attacked, in Salon and all the rest of it. And so libertarians develop a desire for becoming more significant, in the world as it is. And the only way to really achieve this is by veering towards one of the other prevailing paradigms: the reds, the browns, the greens. So in fact, you do see this in libertarianism. People, tending towards the brown camp, or tending towards the red camp, or tending towards the greens, just as a kind of a way of finding sort of actualization and voice for our political philosophy. So all that's by way of introduction. This is why I think it's this document that I wanted to discuss with you tonight, The End of Politics by Karl Hess, is so important. It's a kind of urtext of modern libertarianism. It's a beautiful and sweeping and really philosophically magnificent, not to mention deeply poetic, almost symphonic in its prose. I mean, he was a brilliant writer, and he combines this with an extraordinarily robust intellectual outlook, and puts it all in the course of maybe 4,000 words, 4,000 or 5,000 words in one essay. I think it bears rereading, just as a reminder of who we are and what we believe. So if you don't mind, I think I'll just read just a little bit of it, because, and by the way, actually, let me give a little bit of a biographical introduction to who he was. Let me see if I can find his birth and death dates really quickly here. Okay, he was born in 1923, and he died in 1994. And he was born in Washington, D.C., kind of a child of a well-to-do family. Came from, sort of a upper middle class background, destined for sort of professional greatness. But he was touched by an intellectual spirit and dropped out, I think of high school, just because he was just frustrated with it and decided to just pursue a life of the mind just on his own. And he rose up the ranks in journalism. And when Barry Goldwater ran for president in 1964, he became one of his speechwriters. And sometimes that phrase, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, is attributed to Karl Hess. Apparently, that's not true. It was actually Brent Bozell. But Karl Hess did write a lot for Goldwater, wrote a lot of his speeches, and he maintained a lifelong affection for Barry Goldwater as a principled man. It's actually interesting when you think back in the Goldwater era. He was much more libertarian than any of those clowns you saw on stage the other night, for example, the GOP debate. In fact, before Barry Goldwater died, he made some very libertarian public statements, against drug illegalization. And he was sick of, the social policies of the Christian right. He made himself very vocal about that. He was much more of a libertarian Republican than Reagan ever was, for example. And, even on issues of military where Karl Hess disagreed with him, obviously, he was not as much a warmonger as people think. I mean, he was one of the first people to propose negotiations to eliminate nuclear weapons, for example. He was actually better on Cold War than many of his contemporaries. And, you only have to read Conscience of a Conservatism by Barry Goldwater, which did Karl Hess write that? I'm not sure. There's probably something about that in the afterword by Jeff Riggenbach here. But it's a very inspiring book, even to this day, calls the abolition of Social Security. And, he would speak in front of older people and say, I think you're living at other people's expense. We have to eliminate Social Security. He never pandered to the crowd. He was a deeply principled advocate of the very limited state. Actually, like I say, he was wrong on aspects of the Cold War, but otherwise he was actually wonderful. And in 1964, there's no such thing as a Christian right, for example. It wasn't part of the Republican coalition. That didn't come along until Reagan desperately needed these people to get elected, because, obviously Barry Goldwater lost and nobody wanted to repeat that again. So the addition of the Christian right into the Republican coalition became very important for the margin of victory. But back in those days, there was no such thing as the Christian right. And Barry Goldwater was the closest thing probably we've had to a libertarian running in any major party with the nomination, ever since. So anyway, Hess was one of his speechwriters, and probably a fairly well convinced sort of libertarian rightist. But then after that campaign, he moved ever more into kind of a pure libertarianism, and moved in the circle of friends that began to develop in the 1960s, including Leonard Liggio, Murray Rothbard, Samuel Konkin, and Karl Hess. And Karl Hess was one of the leading lights in this group, very good friends with Murray, and really just a kind of a great spokesperson for libertarianism. And as you read this essay, what you find is it combines many outlooks that today are often separated. For example, the ending has a strong Randian objectivist feel to it. The beginning has another one of this generation was Robert Lefebvre. The beginning has a very strong sort of Robert Lefebvre feeling to it. You can spot Murray Rothbard's views, at least as they stood in the late 1960s, coming through on a case-by-case basis. And then you have an agorist emphasis, from that Samuel Konkin brought to the whole project. And then you had Karl Hess's own signature, which I think of as being a kind of, I don't know how to put it, but like an emphasis on entrepreneurship from the poor. He became a real champion of the poor, and particularly of racial minorities. and entrepreneurship associated with that. And there's a lot in this essay that discusses this. So, I mean, what you'll find in this essay is not sort of one variety of libertarianism, not right, left, all this nonsense people talk about nowadays, but what as I say, a kind of a urtext, a kind of a, to use Walter Block's term, a plumb line. But it's not just plumb line in terms of policy, because he doesn't just talk about policy. What he's doing in this essay is forging a kind of social, political, cultural outlook of libertarianism, of liberal libertarianism, that I would like to see recaptured today, that I don't quite see exist. Here's the other thing about the libertarianism in this essay. It's not necessarily political. In fact, the title of the essay is The End of Politics. He doesn't see politics as an answer. He sees it as always and everywhere the problem. And you can't use the problem to find the solution. What you have to do is defeat the problem. He wants to defeat politics through a kind of a cultural, social, intellectual activism that gradually comes to outrun the state. I mean, so his answer here is not political. So, like, he eventually did, I think, edit the LP, Libertarian Party News, but I knew he was never an advocate of party activism. Unlike Murray, threw himself completely into party activism. Hess was never a part of that. So he was not political. He was not necessarily, like a lot of libertarians are today, exclusively interested in academics. In fact, he didn't seem to have that much interest in academia at all. His main emphasis was on entrepreneurship, and creativity as a means of freeing the world. So you can see it's very prescient in that respect. So this became his position. And I think it's a very valuable, and I think it's very sad in a way that people have forgotten about him. The opening essay in this book by Jackson Stucker actually speculates something interesting, that maybe one of the reasons he's not well remembered is that his libertarianism couldn't be reduced to a simple principle, axiom, or logical rule. And he didn't easily fit into these left-right categories. And so he got sort of squeezed out. And the politicization of libertarianism that emerged in the 1980s, and he gradually, got left behind. But I don't know if that's really true. I find that an interesting claim. And if it is true, that's all the more reason why it needs to be revisited now. But let me just give you a flavor of this. By the way, some of the surprises you'll encounter in this essay, some very powerful material here. I think actually the material that stands out to me most in this essay is the material on racial conflict and the poor. And in here he has some extremely interesting insights. He tends to be all for any kind of revolutionary activism, whether it seems to come from the left or the right or anywhere. And there was a lot brewing in the world. I think about it, 1968, 69. So you had riots and ghettos, as they were then called. I don't know what we call them now, the inner city, I suppose, but in those days they were called the ghettos. Riots against white-owned businesses for having too much money. And the people on the right would typically ascribe this to let me see if I can find this, to a kind of yeah, here we go, I can read this to you, to resentment and leftism on the part of poor blacks, and therefore fanning a kind of racial resentment towards them. Hess had a completely different view. And let me just back up here. Let me just read you this. And I want to go back to the beginning too, but I want to read you this section because I think it's extremely insightful. I mean, as I read these things, certain passages just jump out to me like, oh, I'd never really thought of it that way before. Okay, so this is interesting. Riots in modern America must be broken down into component parts. They are not all simple looting and violence against life and property. They're also directed against the prevailing violence of the state. the sort of ongoing civic violence that permits regular, again, 1969, regular police supervision of everyday life in some neighborhoods. Hess was talking about this in 1969. Most of us have only recently discovered that this is going on thanks to the internet and YouTube. I mean, he's talking about it. Ongoing civic violence permits regular police supervision of everyday life in some neighborhoods. The rules and regulations that inhibit absolutely free trading, the public schools that serve the visions of bureaucracy rather than the varieties of individual people. Again, 1969. There is violence also by those who simply want to shoot their way into political power, otherwise denied them. Conservatives seem to think that the greater state police power is the answer. Liberals seem to think that the more preferential state welfare power is the answer. Power, power, power. Except for ordinary looters, for whom the answer must be to stop them as you would any thief. Okay, so no reason to call it the cops. You just stop them as you would stop any thief. The National Guard doesn't need to be there. The real answer to rioting must lie elsewhere. It must lie in the abandonment and not the extension of state power. State power that oppresses people, state power that tempts people. To cite one strong example, the white stores in many black neighborhoods, which are said to cause such dissatisfaction and envy, have a special unrealized advantage thanks to state power. In a very poor neighborhood, there may be many with the natural ability to open a retail store, but it is much less likely that these people would also have the ability to meet all the state and city regulations governing everything from cleanliness to bookkeeping, which very often comprise the marginal difference between going into business or staying out. That, to me, is an extraordinary insight. It never quite occurred to me before. Of course, you can't just start a business, anywhere. And this is 1969. It's a lot easier then than now. Especially now, you can't just start a business. Those people who do get through the bureaucracies, they comply with the zoning laws, that are able to comply with the ridiculous tax laws, that comply with Obamacare, they comply with all city, state, and federal regulations governing everything from cleanliness to bookkeeping and everything else. I mean, the regulations now are 10,000-fold over what they were back then. That's allowed. That compliance is an advantage of a ruling class elite and is not available to the average person on the street. So this creates a form of resentment. He goes on to say, in a real laissez-faire society, the local entrepreneur with whom the neighbors might prefer to deal could go openly into business. And what would they sell? Well, selling marijuana, whiskey, numbers, slips, books, food, medical advice from the trunk. He could figure out about ledgers, forms, and reports and simply get on with the business of business rather than the business of bureaucracy. Allowing ghetto dwellers to compete on their own terms rather than someone else's should prove a more satisfying and practical solution to the problems in these communities than either rampages or restrictions. So I thought that was an awesome insight and never quite appreciated the magnitude of the point he's trying to make. That in 1969, what everybody calls civil strife, what seems to be racial conflict, is actually just a result of interventionist economics that with every tax, every regulation, every mandate, every rule privileges those who are prepared to and have the resources in place to adhere to those rules, and punishes those who are on the outside. So the system is already rigged. And in his view, a lot of the rioting and sense of injustice that you saw on display in those times that tended to fall along racial lines were just a reflection of the absence of laissez-faire. I mean, isn't that extraordinary? I mean, I was just, what came to mind as I read that passage? And I'm sorry, I don't remember his name. I'm so bad with names. But the case of this guy who was killed in an altercation with the cops when they tried to arrest him for selling bootleg cigarettes. There you go. Try to sell bootleg cigarettes, you're going to have the cops crawling all over you. Resistance ensues, violence amps up. You get a death that angers people, divides the communities. It's just a beautiful example of that. The drug war. I mean, my goodness, what can you say about that? I mean, don't forget this was written in 1969 before Nixon had declared the war on drugs, actually. So it was even bad back then. But before our time is up here, I do want to go back to the beginning here. In any case, so I keep delaying this, but if I wanted to characterize this essay, I'd point out just several things that are distinct about it. He sees libertarianism as a movement that's pro-civil liberties. It's in favor of civil rights. He sees it as a civil rights movement, very much sympathetic with the civil rights movement of the time, although always tweaking it a little bit to draw attention to the fact that it's politics in the state that causes the conflict, and they're never the answers. A free speech movement. He hammers away, I mean, so beautifully in this essay about the censorship of the FCC. I mean, in 1969, there were 3 channels, right? And everything had to be, was filtered by government. Anybody who could communicate with anybody else, had to go through a government bureaucracy in any of the media and communications technology at the time. I mean, it makes me so grateful for the internet today. I mean, when you're reading this, you're like, oh my God, it's true. It was like an authoritarian society back in 1969. So he sees libertarianism, a free speech movement, a pro-poor movement, a civil rights movement, a movement in favor of radical civil liberties. Even though a lot of the essay is discussing and defending Goldwater, it's extremely hard on conservatism as that it evolved by 1969. Basically considers it a warmongering authoritarian philosophy. But he's just as hard on the left, too, for having a very naive understanding of the state. Karl Hess's libertarianism is neither right nor left. I mean, it's just a straight down the line, beautiful, humane, benevolent, community-minded, a loving, pro-neighbor, pro-trade, pro-voluntarism, pro-human being form of libertarianism. I mean, where does that exist today? I mean, yes, it's out there, and people are struggling to push it, but day to day, it's being swamped, I would say, by alternative views that are not humane, that are not benevolent, that are not anti-political, that are not about community. They're being buffeted by the browns, the reds, and the greens. So this is why I think this essay is so important. So let me just start it for you, and you can get a sense of what it was like. As I read, you have to put yourself in the mind of a reader in 1969, which is rather difficult to do. I mean, this is before the birth of modernity as we know it, I mean, long before the internet. The Vietnam War was raging, draft riots. And, a lot of the essay discusses the draft as being a wicked form of slavery. Draft riots were going on. The famous political murders in the 1960s had rocked so many people. The gold standard was collapsing. A very difficult time of a lot of intellectual and ideological confusion and cultural, social, political upheaval. And then there's this beautiful statement by Karl Hess, where he basically announces that libertarianism has the answer. He begins it like this. This is not a time of radical revolutionary politics, not yet. Unrest, riot, dissent, and chaos notwithstanding, today's politics is reactionary. Both the left and the right are reactionary and authoritarian. That is to say, both are political. They seek only to revise current methods of acquiring and wielding political power. Radical and revolutionary movements seek not to revise, but to revoke. The target of revocation should be obvious. The target is politics itself. Yeah. I don't know if you could ever improve on an opening like that. Radicals and revolutionaries have had their sights trained on politics for some time as governments fail around the world, as more millions become aware that government has never and can never humanely and effectively manage men's affairs. Government's own inadequacy will emerge at last as the basis for a truly radical and revolutionary movement. In the meantime, the radical revolutionary movement is a lonely one. It is feared and hated by both the right and the left, although both right and left must borrow from it to survive. The radical revolutionary position is libertarianism, and its socioeconomic form is laissez-faire capitalism. That's just an awesome paragraph. So much truth, so much beauty in that. Now, he gives a one-paragraph summary of libertarianism that I think should be more or less committed to memory. I mean, when you forget in the midst of all these debates, whether it's on Facebook or Twitter or God knows wherever else, to remember this paragraph is to remember pretty much everything. If you apply this across the board, you'll have a good sense of what libertarianism is. Libertarianism is the view that each man is the absolute owner of his life, to use and dispose of as he sees fit, that all man's social actions should be voluntary, and that respect for every other man's similar and equal ownership of life, and by extension, the property and the fruits of that life, is the ethical basis of a humane and open society. In this view, the only, repeat, only, function of government or law is to provide the sort of self-defense against violence that an individual, if he were powerful enough, would provide for himself. And he goes on to explain, it's actually interesting. I mean, is this an anarchist essay? Well, it is, but it also allows the possibility of limited government. So he straddles the difference there. He's not trying to trick you. He's not trying to evade the question of anarchy versus a limited government. All he's saying is that the function of law is to provide the sort of self-defense against violence, that if an individual were powerful enough would provide for himself. That's all he's saying. Where this law comes from, private law or a state, is not something libertarianism would necessarily decide, but obviously he's personally an anarchist, so he leans the essay in that direction. The only reason he stops from endorsing anarchism as a program is because he believes that it's possible for individuals to come together and voluntarily form what looks and seems like governments to the outside world, and he doesn't want a dogmatic position that would rule that out. In other words, he's anticipating the development of polycentric legal tradition. This is true throughout the essay. I mean, there's just so much that he anticipates that would later come to fruition in the works of like David Friedman and Murray Rothbard and Samuel Konkin and the Agrarist movement and the Free State Project and you name it, voluntarist movement and so on. All these things were yet to come, but you can find every bit of it in here, and all with the right emphasis, it seems to me. He goes on, laissez-faire capitalism or anarcho-capitalism is simply the economic form of the libertarian ethic. Laissez-faire capitalism encompasses the notion that men should exchange goods and services without regulation solely on the basis of value for value. It recognizes charity and communal enterprises as voluntary versions of the same ethic. So it's not all about corporations. Such a system would be straight barter, except for the widely felt need for a division of labor, in which men voluntarily accept value tokens such as cash and credit. Economically, this system is anarchy, and proudly so. Libertarianism is rejected by the modern left, which preaches individualism but practices collectivism, and capitalism is rejected by the modern right, which preaches enterprise but practices protectionism. And we could add and corporatism. The libertarian faith in the mind of man is rejected by religionists who have faith only in the sins of man. So you've got already an attack on the nascent religious right going on here. The libertarian insistence that men be free to spin cables of steel as well as dreams of smoke is rejected by hippies who adore nature but spurn creation. So there you go. I mean, he's got it, right? Libertarianism is not brown, it's not red, it's not green. The libertarian insistence that each man is a sovereign land of liberty. Each man is a sovereign land of liberty, with his primary allegiance to himself, is rejected by patriots who sing of freedom, but also shout of banners and boundaries. There is no operating movement in the world today that is based upon a libertarian philosophy, and if there were, it would be in the anomalous position of using political power to abolish political power. Of course, 3 years later, the Libertarian Party was founded. Perhaps a regular political movement overcoming this anomaly will actually develop. And then he goes on to discuss the 64 campaign in a very historically enlightened way. I mean, if you ever want to find out what was that campaign all about, the Goldwater movement, I just can't think of a better source. Okay, let me just conclude here, because I want to read the end. I'm fascinated by his rhetoric in the course of this essay, because he starts off with a kind of Lefebvreite, Rothbardian perspective, but it's also radically anti-politics. So you've got a pure anarchist there. He's embracing polycentric legal traditions, so he's a little bit wary about using the term anarchism for fear that it would be seen as excessively dogmatic. And you've got a kind of the what today we would call left libertarian concerns for civil liberties and civil rights and that sort of thing, but a strong endorsement of capitalism without corporatism. But he wants this capitalism to be universal and pertain to the poor. So you have all this. But what surprises you as you get towards the end, you discern within Karl Hess just what a powerful influence that Rand had on him. In fact, at one point in this essay, he defends Rand against the constant attacks by the Buckleyite National Review crowd. So he's got Rand and Rothbard and Lefebvre and probably a lot of Chodorov and everybody in this. So it's a kind of a beautiful statement. Power and authority as substitutes for performance and rational thought are the specters that haunt the world today. They are the ghosts of odd and superstitious yesterdays, and politics is their familiar. Politics through time has been an institutionalized denial of man's ability to survive through the exclusive employment of all of his powers for his own welfare. And politics through time has existed solely through the resources that it has been able to plunder from the creative and productive people whom it has, in the name of many causes and moralities, denied the exclusive employment of all their powers for their own welfare. Ultimately, this must mean that politics denies the rational nature of man. So here you have a kind of a Randian apparatus employed against all politics. Ultimately, it means that politics is just another form of residual magic in our culture, a belief that somehow things come from nothing, that things may be given to some without first taking them for others, that all the tools of man's survival are his by accident or divine right, and not by pure and simple inventiveness and work. Politics has always been the institutionalized and established way in which some men have exercised the power to live off the output of other men. But even in a world made docile to these demands, men do not need to live by devouring other men. Politics does devour men. A laissez-faire world would liberate men. And it is in that sort of liberation that the most profound revolution of all may be just beginning to stir. And it will not happen overnight, just as the lamps of rationalism were not quickly lighted and have not yet burned out, not yet burned brightly. But it will happen, because it must happen. Man can survive in an inclement universe only through the use of his mind. His thumbs, his nails, his muscles, and his mysticism will not be enough to keep him alive without it. So that's the way the essay concludes. Very nice, huh? Beautiful essay, poetic. I mean, what a writer, what a brilliant mind. And I hope you've gained an appreciation for just what he meant. he was immensely influential in his time with that generation of libertarians. I mean, to have a person of his stature come out in such a massive, major national, international magazine, throwing down the gauntlet, saying, we're libertarians and we're here. Here is what we believe. Our vision of the world is humane, it's radical, it's revolutionary. It trusts people, not politics. In fact, it wants to get rid of politics entirely and set the world free to build a beautiful prosperity that applies to all people on the planet, regardless of nation, race, sex, everything. And that's the vision of Karl Hess. And I think this essay does a very, very good job as a full-blown statement of libertarianism in its post-war birth. And so that for that reason, I think we need to go back to it and revisit it, if only to discover who we are and what we believe in the face of all the frenzy and controversies that we face every day. It's important for other reasons too. Yeah, so it's important for historical reasons, so we can remember and understand what it was like. But it's also, I think, important for the future. I mean, after all, you have in this essay something you didn't often get in writings at the time. A celebration of technology as a tool of liberation. A universalist creed that believed that liberty burned in the hearts of all people and of all races and all places of all faiths. And a perceptive power to see that there's a kind of libertarianism that exists in every movement that's dissatisfied with the status quo. And so his driving message here was, don't look to the state, look towards yourself. Let's do everything we can together as a people to get rid of this ruling class apparatus that's inhibiting us and hold us back, and come together to build real communities and real freedom for ourselves. I find it just a tremendously inspiring message. I'm embarrassed that I've only read it recently for the first time. I realize now what a gigantically important essay it was and continues to be. So let's remember Karl Hess, remember the contribution he made to libertarianism, revisit his humane, beautiful, community-minded outlook, recapture it, and carry it on into a future of robust and beautiful burgeoning anarchy in the 21st century. Thank you so much for being with me tonight. And as I mentioned to you, you can download this book from Liberty.me. As far as I know, it's the only place you can get it. If you haven't joined, join now. Download this book, give it a read, contemplate it, write to me, hang out in the forums, and let's work on building our own community first, right? All the best to you, and thank you for joining me tonight. We'll talk to you very soon. Bye-bye.